Welcome to the panel about serverless versus Kubernetes. Yeah, so I was pretty excited about moderating this panel because this is a topic that I've been intrigued about. And actually, it's been bothering me a lot. Been a little confused about it. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to pick the brains of these really experienced people here. I'm going to introduce them really quickly, 5 seconds each. From left to right on the next slide. Rachit Lohani was CTO and SVP of engineering, or is at Paylocity. Before that, he was head of engineering at Atlassian, and before that, director of engineering at Intuit. And before that, engineering manager at Netflix. And then Siddharth Ram, who's here with me, is currently CTO and SVP of engineering at Inflection, but before that, he was VP and engineering fellow at Intuit and senior staff engineer and engineering manager at Qualcomm for more than a decade. And Shridhar Pandey is senior product manager of Lambda. That'll be interesting. And Kenneth, last but not least, co-founder at Tasq. Before that, British Petroleum, now BP for 3 years. Before that, Shell for 3 years. Kenneth, you're not Indian, are you? Can you hear me? Is he on the right panel? The organizers have decided to allow it. I will make jokes during moderation here. I had aspirations of being a stand-up comedian, but you know how Indian parents are, not supportive of the arts. Kenneth, you probably didn't have that problem with your Asian parents. So here's what's bothering me. John, if you could go to the managing state in Kubernetes slides. I'm just going to set up something, and I'm going to make a couple of controversial, possibly incorrect statements, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to push back on some of them. Because just to put my cards on the table, what I'm trying to establish here is a chain of logic that Kubernetes apps, most Kubernetes apps are stateless, or they should be stateless. And then if so, why not just use Lambda? That's simpler. And if you can go to Lambda or serverless, then you can be autonomous. So I'm going to invite the panelists to comment on this. So what I just wanted to establish here is I took some screenshots from the white paper of a very popular database company. And these are the 3 ways they say you could run the database in Kubernetes. Option 1 is run it outside of Kubernetes and manage it yourself. So it could be on VMs, it could be on bare metal, whatever. It's outside Kubernetes, which means your Kubernetes app is stateless because this data is outside of Kubernetes. If you go to the next slide, here they say you could use a cloud data service from your Kubernetes app, which again means that your Kubernetes is stateless because you're using a cloud data service, and that's where the state is. And then lastly, if you go to the next slide, this is how they are encouraging customers to run their database in Kubernetes. And they're saying you can use stateful sets and daemon sets and configure their software, and it'll be scalable, clustered, managed by Kubernetes. Seems complicated, and they have their own opinions on what's simple and what's hard. And my contention is that the first 2 are how people are doing it, or how they should do it, and so it's stateless. And so then why not just go to serverless and Lambda? So I'm not going to go in the order of left to right. Because you're here, I'm going to go to you first. I've already introduced you. And I've read your blog posts, and I know you share some of this sentiment. So maybe keep me honest, and I've made some sort of leaps of logic. So push back if you need to, but otherwise fill in the rest.
Sure. First thing I would say is I would not take Kubernetes advice from a database company. So you should make sure of that, because I don't think databases run generally on Kubernetes. I'm questioning, how well are they really versed in the intricacies of Kubernetes?
That's right. And sorry to interrupt. I should have said here that this kind of stuff here in option 3 should be done by the database company, if at all, by somebody. And maybe they shouldn't even use Kubernetes to do it.
They won't deploy on Kubernetes, but say, if you're not using our database, here's what you could do.
Right.
So I would. So by the way, I'm no longer at Inflection. Inflection got acquired by another company and Checker, and so I'm actually not at Inflection any longer. But while I was at Inflection, we actually took up the challenge exactly as what you're saying. Why isn't everything on Lambda? And we actually were running on Kubernetes, and the realization I had was, in my opinion, I wanted to be cloud native. That was the goal that I wanted. And to me, being on Kubernetes was actually not being cloud native. There were a whole bunch of Kubernetes specific things you needed to learn, you needed to understand, you needed to do. And, I heard Benji referring to some of that stuff. You really need to know how to manage the system. You have to configure these parameters. You have to know about networking, and there's etcd and all this stuff. And so we had actually engineers whose job was to run our Kubernetes cluster. And not only that, you lose one of these engineers, you have to go and hunt for another such engineer to fill that in. And I was like, do I really want to be a container management company? Because that's what I kind of feel myself, going in that direction. And instead we decided, no, we're not going to do that. We are actually going to move to serverless. So we actually pulled the cord and said, okay, no more Kubernetes. For most companies, if you're an e-commerce kind of company, what are the kinds of things you do? I mean, there's a lot of data kind of stuff that you do. I'm going to keep that aside. There's almost always a specialized stack. But you get HTTP requests, you do look up some data in the database, you maybe add a couple of numbers and you show something to the customer. I mean, it's a very request response kind of thing that most e-commerce kinds of companies, most SaaS companies, I think, do. It's perfect for Lambda. I don't want to be in the business of managing all this infrastructure. I want that to be someone else's headache. I'm really happy if AWS takes that on, So we actually moved pretty much everything to Lambda, which actually unlocked a lot of value for us, because now we are also able to, tie it into all the autonomous things that we are talking about today. And I had a terrific experience with it. And, it's something I would certainly recommend to anyone else who's thinking about which direction I should go. I'm sure there'll be others, and maybe Rachit or others will have, have a different point of view, but that's where my head is at. In most cases, I think serverless does make sense, and I don't see why you should be going. I'd quickly add, the biggest complaint or concern that people have is, that's vendor lock-in. If you're using Lambda, you're on AWS. I'm like, yeah, but so what? I mean, we, willingly choose to pick a particular language and work on it, or have our code run a particular processor. We make hundreds of tiny decisions everywhere. I don't understand why, vendor lock-in is such a bad thing. I'm actually okay with being locked into AWS.
Yeah, I've got a couple follow-ups, but I'll go to the others and come back for the follow-ups. Okay, so Rachit, we skipped you. I've got intel on all of you, by the way. So it sounds like you've standardized on Lambda, but almost completely, and you have exceptions for which you use Kubernetes. Is that right? Well, first of all, would you push back on any of the leaps in logic that I made? Siddharth clearly didn't. He completely agreed with me, right? So would you like to push back on any of that, and then maybe talk about? It sounds like you mostly agree, but you had to make some exceptions for Kubernetes. Maybe talk about why.
I mostly agree with the technology. I'm not sure if I'm fully aligned with the steps that you took to get to the outcome, which was autonomous systems, right? Which was, I start somewhere. If I'm Kubernetes, I'm stateless. I can be Lambdas. If I'm on Lambdas, I can be autonomous. I think Kubernetes system can be autonomous as well. Those are two separate pieces. It just depends on the path that you take to get there, right?
So you don't think it's easier to be autonomous if you're on serverless?
Is it easier to be autonomous on serverless? I would say both of them will require the same amount of work, because so steps to get to autonomous systems. First, you need to have a very good understanding of what you're dealing with. Step 2, break it down into steps. Step 3, automate those pieces. Step 4, add metrics, attribution to these steps, so that way it's logical flow. That way a computer or a machine can make decisions on your behalf. Step 5 is you let it run, right? So the biggest play here is metrics and attribution. That is what would power autonomous systems. It's less about the platform that you're in, the technical choices that you've made.
So you're assuming there that the Kubernetes app is totally stateless, right? Because if you're managing your own state or databases, like in option 3, like this company recommends, then it's kind of hard to be autonomous that way, right?
So again, that depends. Stateless systems are where the state is not managed in your container, your JVM, right? Or that instance which is running. You extract it out to a persistent DB store, and now you have a stateless app. Stateless apps are easier to scale up and down. You get the elasticity, the flexibility. So we had a very similar debate. This was 2011, 2012. And the question that we had was, should we put our stateless systems on AWS when they are not very stable? The options in front of us was Rackspace or AWS. AWS, very new with their EC2 offerings, did not promise that EC2s would stay up. And now the paradigm has shifted. It changed, right? So can I put a stateless or stateful app on Kubernetes? Of course I can. Absolutely. There's no one stopping me, as long as I can guarantee that I won't lose that instance.
And so I derailed you by talking about whether you could be autonomous only on serverless. You were going to talk about why you've almost completely converted to serverless, but not completely.
Kubernetes versus serverless, for us, it's a technical choice, and it depends on what is the problem that we're solving for. So the world that we live in, we still have a data center. We want our devs to be agnostic to where this artifact will be deployed, so that they can be more effective and focus on the thing that they're hired for, which is build business logic, build customer-facing apps, build these capabilities. We don't want them to worry about where will you run this, how will you manage it, how will you scale up, scale down. So we needed something, an abstraction layer that will hide that complexity from them, that will hide whether you're running in a data center or AWS. Something that they can specify in a YAML, and we would translate it, and we would know exactly how many resources to allocate, when to scale up, should we scale up or not. That abstraction was provided by Kubernetes. They provided a very seamless path for us to move from data center to AWS. Now I can hide all of that complexity from my devs, just ask them to everything, put everything in Git. That way, when they deploy, I just read it and make the magic happen. So this is where Kubernetes helps us a lot. And that is so this is the exception path. So if you are building a high throughput system where cold starts could be a problem, like very latency sensitive, high throughput systems, Kubernetes could actually make sense. Now, the next question then becomes, do you want to manage Kubernetes, or do you want AWS or a third party to manage Kubernetes? That's a business call. And I would refrain from saying things like, we are not in a business to manage Kubernetes, which I agree with. But the distinction there is very much like, we're not in the business of managing Java or JVMs, right? But we have to do that in order to get to certain outcomes. So it all depends on what are the engineering problems that you want to solve in-house, which ones do you want to offload that you don't want to deal with, and still get the maximum value. The value comes from the code, the application that we write, that eventually add value to the customer ecosystem. That is how our business thrives.
Okay, I think Siddharth might want to jump in here, but just a clarification: was my information correct or incorrect then, that you have not almost fully converted to Lambda?
So there are applications that are still running on Kubernetes, and some in our data center, but on Kubernetes.
And is that just because you haven't gotten to them yet, or is there something special about them that they need to keep running on Kubernetes?
Yeah, so it's the engineering investment, the investment to break them into smaller pieces, deploy them into, or refactor the whole thing, deploy them on Lambdas would be very expensive. So we made the business call around, let's not do it. Let's keep it on Kubernetes because it is doing what it's supposed to. We're getting the maximum value from this. It is a monolith, but our devs are able, but it's tightly contained. So when we need to build features and capabilities, we build around it, and we have built those adapters and plugins so that way we don't bloat one repo, and we get the maximum value out of what we're doing.
Okay, so they're working. Nothing's broken. Don't try to fix what's not broken. It would be effort to rewrite them, convert them, and that's mainly why they're on Kubernetes. If you had to write them again today, would you use serverless?
So what you said initially, that is our approach. The default path is Lambdas. If you're building something, just go with Lambdas. Like, we don't want you to spend your brain power in learning new systems. But if it requires a discussion and you have a use case, a team could come out and say, we will process 1 billion transactions in a month. On Kubernetes or on Lambdas, the cost could be prohibitive. Okay, let's do the math. If it is so, let's go Kubernetes route, right? But there needs to be a rationale for someone to invoke that exception path. The default path would be Lambdas.
Okay, understood. Did you want to jump in, or should I keep going?
Just a couple of quick notes. I completely hear what Rachit is saying. Philosophically, I have a slightly different perspective, which is centered on two things. One, lesser variation is better than more variation. So I prefer to, wherever possible, have fewer strains of a technology. And the second thing is abstraction layers always add complexity. And to me, Kubernetes, there are lots of abstractions that need to be done, which adds complexity. So, to me, the fewer abstraction layers I have, the happier I am. Or the fewest necessary abstraction layers.
Yeah. Okay. So, Shridhar, it feels strange to ask you, since you're the product manager of Lambda, how you feel about this topic. Do you find internally at Amazon there are little fiefdoms and friendly rivalries about which architecture to promote? Or would you push back in any way with anything anyone has said?
No, I just see these as different school of thoughts, right? And as a matter of fact, if we were in fiefdoms, as you said, we wouldn't support container package format, packaging format on Lambda, which we started, I believe, in towards end of 2020, right? So, and again, that was not so that you bring your container workloads to Lambda or Kubernetes folks jump onto Lambda. It was more so that if you are comfortable with a certain packaging format, you can still use Lambda for its benefits like elasticity, scalability, and not having to cost benefits that you're getting out of it. That said, if containers for you are those wrong, the traditional long running applications where you bind to a port and listen for TCP or HTTP calls and wait to do things when you're called, That's not what Lambda does, right? Lambda, it lies very much in the camp of event-driven architecture, and therefore, just because you can run run containers on Lambda does not mean that's the best fit for it, because at AWS we have other offerings for that sort of workload. So it's sort of a mental shift, and I sort of align with what Siddharth mentioned at the top, that if you have determined that you don't want to be go down that path and don't want to care about how it is deployed, and you don't want to build the abstraction layer yourself, just go with some offering or platform that can provide you that. But not all workloads will be suited on Lambda, and we recognize that internally, as well as when we talk about it outside of the AWS fold. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, because it was not a very straight yes or no, but that's how we think about it or reason about it internally as well.
He has to be diplomatic, AWS.
Yeah, it's unnecessarily diplomatic. Yeah, although you did say you aligned with Siddharth, and Siddharth was pretty emphatic that there's no reason for Kubernetes.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. There might be someone from Intuit listening in. They have a huge deployment, and I used to work with them.
That's right. I noticed that. So in one of your blog posts, you said that at Intuit it was mostly Kubernetes, and then when you left Intuit, it was mostly serverless. And
That's right. Because I think with these things, context is always king. If Rachit is on a different path, it's because I don't understand his context, and that is really, really important. At Intuit, we had this mass of really, really knowledgeable Kubernetes people who knew how to build it, who knew that we could run it with zero SREs involved. Actually, I don't think Intuit has SREs, in spite of a massive, think about the entire tax peak being served out of Kubernetes. It's just amazing, but they have the expertise, they have the knowledge, they've built their own platform. They call it IKS, Intuit Kubernetes Service, on top of, AWS. It works for them. And at the scale they are at, it makes sense for them to do it. But at a smaller company, I was at a startup, Inflection, I don't think it makes the same amount of sense.
That doesn't sound like a good reason. Your reason was that they're doing Kubernetes because they have a lot of people to manage Kubernetes.
Okay, so I know about Intuit. They actually support both. They have a paved road for Kubernetes and they have a paved road for serverless, right? So teams can actually pick what they want. And in some cases, it actually makes, under certain circumstances, I do think it makes sense to actually adopt Kubernetes. But a precondition, what I was trying to say, a precondition for that is you already must have access to the talent required to actually run a platform for Kubernetes, and Intuit already had that.
Kenneth, you've got many small workloads and pub sub messaging. You've got a mix of event and batch-driven workloads. You've got Lambdas being used to train thousands of models. Would you push back on anything anyone has said, particularly me? So I'm trying to get to the right answer here. Or would you agree?
Yeah, so I think for our use case, right, it makes sense to deploy on serverless, especially starting out with a startup. One of the main things you want to ensure that you have is flexibility in trying to de-risk and identify the problem you're trying to solve, right? You're coming into this market with an idea, it needs to be tested, it needs to be iterated over, and you need to be able to move quickly and iterate, and just using serverless functions such as AWS Lambdas made sense for us just in order to move quickly. Now, as we've de-risked the problem and understand exactly, what's our use case, the usage pattern, etc., there's a world where we are seeing, maybe Kubernetes or really some form of distributed computing makes sense, right? Where we have to process large amounts of data for machine learning models. So maybe not specifically Kubernetes, but like things like ECS, Fargate, things like that, where there are services now that are making it a lot easier to manage. AWS being one of them, but thinking about frameworks like Tasq and now Coiled, right? So they make it super easy to spin up instances, spin them down automatically in order to do your heavy workloads. But starting to see that line blur between AWS Lambdas, where they've been making improvements around making Docker images and really beefy Lambda sizes, and getting to this distributed computing side of ECS Fargate and EC2 instances, where there's a little bit of kind of gray area in which you can kind of almost go both ways, right?
Can you talk about? We haven't talked much about autonomous in this panel. We focused on serverless versus Kubernetes. Can you talk about what's gone well with autonomous, and also what in serverless has not gone well for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'll start with the serverless and what hasn't gone well. I think everyone generally has a battle scar or a nightmare of receiving a really huge AWS bill at the end of the day. And generally that can happen when you're not automating your serverless functions, right? And they run away from you. And then all of a sudden you're emailing AWS and begging them to nullify that bill. So that's definitely been a tough one for us. Hard lessons learned, I would say. Even as useful as it is, if you're not careful with it, then those things can really cost you, right? So I think with autonomous solutions, things like what Sedai is offering, and there's kind of a growing market here, right? It's just being able to kind of have that safety net of either auto adjusting things or alerting you right away without having to add a whole lot of alarms and infrastructure complexity just to send you a message, right?
Yeah. You seem like you wanted to say something.
Sure, I always have lots of opinions on lots of things.
Oh, by the way, I can't see the rest of the panelists. I can't see you, so if you want to jump in, just make a noise.
Actually, maybe I'll pause and see if someone else wanted to jump in. Rachit, if you want to jump in.
No, I think I'm aligned with what Kenneth said. Like, use cases have certain alignment and values, and it depends on what is the problem that you're after. That will help you pick the right solution. But companies usually pick the default path. Like we have picked the default path, which is Lambdas. If there are exception cases, just spar, debate, tell us why, and then we'll make sure that you're fully supported.
So I'm a big fan of thinking of these things in mental models. And the mental model that I always have in my head is what I call the value to cost ratio. That is, what is the greatest value you get out of making a decision, and what's the downside, what's the cost which will slow you down. So Rachit has previously spoken in his previous panel about payroll is almost always the biggest cost. And for me with serverless, the value on the maintenance side, I've basically have no SREs. Actually, with the help of Sedai, it's actually everything in serverless just runs. I mean, we barely even look at it. Once a week, we crack open the panel and see, okay, what's going on. So it's been hugely valuable. On the value side, what I'm always looking at, the biggest value is customer happiness, reflected by NPS scores, trailing scores like NPS or TNPS or whatever that might be. And to me, the speed at which we are able to move, whether it's to resolve issues, whether it's to launch new features, that's the top level functionality that we get out of Lambda in a way which I think is absolutely spectacular. So which is one of the reasons I'm such a huge fan, because we move incredibly fast. We do things like testing in production because we're using feature flags and releasing directly into production and doing our actual testing in production. That just gives us unparalleled velocity. Now, I'm not saying that you can't do things like that on Kubernetes. Of course you can, but to me the match for a low cost, because of you don't need to pay a whole lot of attention to it, thanks to tools we have deployed Sedai, and the pace velocity at which we're able to move the top level number has just made me a fan.
Yeah, well, I would ask Shridhar to comment, but he's probably sending emails internally raising prices. John, can you put up the comparison? I forget what the title is. Yeah, that one. So all the panelists saw this before the panel. Nobody pushed back. Nobody commented. So do we all agree that this is a fair? Actually, how are we doing on time? Do we have 5 minutes? Couple more minutes. Okay, great. So great way to conclude. Do we all agree that this is accurate here? Plus means good. Plus question means maybe good. Minus means really bad. So Kubernetes operational burden, really bad. Operational burden for serverless functions, very good. And so on. I'll let you look at the chart.
I did give input to John on this, and he actually changed a few things.
Okay. So what was it before, and what input did you give?
Well, do you remember, John? I forget which line items I had comments on.
I think we had some in favor of Kubernetes, and you were
What a surprise.
Okay. So and other panelists, remote panelists. We had more positive marks for Kubernetes than you see here.
But see, the weights have not been attached to them.
The weights as an importance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say is the most important?
Again, like I said, if you think about the value to cost ratio, to me, operational burden is probably the single most important thing. And things like cloud cost, of course, it's important, but to me, it's less important than things like the operational burden.
Right, because the cloud cost, we're assuming, is minuscule compared to payroll.
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a good trade to increase the cloud cost and lower the operational burden.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. And Rachit, any objections to that?
Agreement, kind of, though. So the facts, right? Overall, we know as cloud becomes more commoditized, the cost will keep going down. The cost to hire people keeps going up.
Turn up the volume.
So I'm aligned there. The biggest value for technologies like AWS Lambdas is around operational burden. So if I'm starting a new venture, or I'm in the phase of figuring out my product market fit, it does not make any sense for me to invest in technologies like Kubernetes, build up an arm, because I'm aligned with what you just said, which was we're not in the business of running Kubernetes. Kubernetes becomes a mandatory choice when you get to a certain scale. Till that scale, it's a paved path. Lambdas first, just think in that direction. After a certain investment levels, operational burden starts to, you will inherit some level of complexity, some level of operational burden. So you will build teams to manage those workloads. This is where it starts to, you get to a point where the values start to diminish. And then the discussions become, how can I make my devs stay productive while not taking a big hit on either performance, latency, or any of these entities? So this is where we have to open up multiple paths so that devs have this choice, and we're solving the right problems, which is deliver more features and capabilities to our customers. So when you start, +1, operational cost is one of the key concerns. But over time, it starts to go down the stack.
Okay. Do any of the other remote panelists want to weigh in on this chart?
I would
I hear-
argue that maybe the lift and shift for serverless function. I guess it kind of depends on where you're lifting and shifting to, but now if you're thinking about cross cloud functionality, you have frameworks like Terraform, and unless you're using something that's very I'd say vendor specific in terms of a particular feature, it's I would say it seems to be becoming easier to take what you have in maybe a serverless function, shift it to another provider, or even with the Docker compatibility now with AWS Lambda, take that image elsewhere, right, and put it in a compute container. So I think that that minus there with the serverless functions maybe a little fuzzy plus. So
or minus question.
yeah, minus question.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll summarize by saying that 20 years ago, we used to have discussions about what programming language to write applications in. Should it be a high-level language like Java, or should it be C++? I mean, this was a real debate, Java versus C++. And eventually, people figured out that C++ is a systems language, not an applications language. And so you wanted to write in a less efficient but more payroll-friendly language most of the time, and then write in the systems language where it made sense. And a lot of the comments you all made felt like that. But I'm trying to summarize, so I won't open it up again, and we're out of time. So thank you very much to the panelists. This was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.